Were Jesus' words and teachings really more moral than the violent, narcissistic, and psychopathic ways demonstrated by the God of the Old Testament? Many seem to think so. Throughout my time on the internet sharing studies on Christian theology and the philosophy of the Bible, it's no surprise that many Christians, even those Christians that agree the Bible has textual issues and have completely left the church, still believe the idea that Jesus himself was a good guy, but the rest of the Bible was corrupted. But what is most astounding to me, now a former evangelist and deconstructing agnostic, is that as I examine the arguments against Christianity that are poured out into the World Wide Web every single day, I come across staunch atheists who still believe that Jesus himself was an okay guy who stood for good ideas, but that the application of the New Testament by churches has tainted the good that the character of Jesus was portraying. Today, I like to call that idea into question. The notion that Jesus Christ, as represented in the New Testament, was actually a swell guy with moral concepts, and that his character alone is innocent enough, not deserving to be swept in with the criticisms the rest of the Bible endures. So, were Jesus' words and teachings really that much better than the narcissistic, violent, psychopathic, and sometimes illogical teachings of the Old Testament's God? In this video, we'll examine just 9 of the ways that I believe the New Testament proves that the all-loving and forgiving version of Jesus that most atheists and Christians envision doesn't actually exist. In fact, I believe we can demonstrate that Jesus himself provides adequate reasons for criticism, especially to an atheist or secular humanist. At this point, it must be mentioned that I personally no longer believe that Jesus existed at all, and that if he did, the New Testament is certainly not an accurate depiction of the character himself or any of the words he used or events described. But for the sake of arguing from the Christian perspective, it's necessary to pretend that the New Testament is literally the infallible Word of God and that the teachings of Jesus are in fact accurate and unchanged. It's from that perspective that we dive in. Number 1. He's personally going to kill billions of people when he returns. According to the perspective of Christians and many Christian scholars, the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, contains a detailed yet vague prophecy about the events that would unfold at the time of Jesus' return. This book deals with how churches will be judged, how believers will be saved, and how God would invoke his wrath upon the earth through his beloved Son, Jesus, here in the next text referred to as the Son of Man. Upon the cloud one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth. And the earth was reaped, and the winepress was trodden without the city. And blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horses' bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Revelation 14:14-20. Now it should be added here that the representation of Jesus as the Son of Man using his quote-unquote sickle on the earth and quote reaping the earth is related to the language Jesus used when discussing how he would reap the harvest of his followers upon his return. The rest of the quote-unquote crops that don't belong to him he plans to destroy with fire. At the end of his parable about the wheat and tares in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus says, quote, "Let them grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn." Matthew 13:30. It's clear what is meant here in Revelation 14. In fact, Christianity.com tells us plainly that, quote, "Here we should point out the difference between how believers are described during harvest seasons and unbelievers. Believers take on the role of wheat. You may have heard the term, separate the wheat from the chaff, Matthew 3:12. On the other hand, unbelievers are described as grapes in this passage, and although we fruit lovers may love a good grape, we must understand that grapes and wine represent God's wrath in most scriptural connotations. God's wrath is poured out on those who have not submitted to him, end quote. These passages in Revelation make it clear that when Jesus returns, he plans to pour out his wrath on the unbelievers, cutting them down to nothing, and then discarding them into the fire to be burned. In fact, there'll be so much blood from the massacre that it will flood the streets up to the height of a horse's bridle, saying, quote, "And blood came out of the winepress, even unto the horse's bridle, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. For another example, Revelation 2:16, Jesus says, Repent, or else I will come unto thee quickly, and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. Curious what that's supposed to mean? Never fear. A later chapter in the same book explains with more detail in the following verses. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, and that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, and he treadeth the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. What a beautifully empathetic, compassionate, all-loving, all-forgiving thing for Jesus to do. Destroy the sinners of the earth with the, quote, wrath of the Almighty God, murdering everyone with his mouth sword, then allowing the birds of the air to feast on the flesh of Jesus' enemies, all because these sinners didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Sounds a bit like a narcissistic psychopath if you ask me, but somehow even some atheists are convinced Jesus was a peaceful and tolerant figure. Number 2. Jesus was a warmonger. Many believers and non-believers of the Christian faith are under the impression that Jesus Christ was a man who came to promote peace and unity across the world. But actually, the total opposite of that is true. He came to destroy families and start a war. In fact, he tells us himself in Matthew 10 verse 34 that, Think not that I come to send peace on earth. I come not to send peace, but a sword. And also in Luke chapter 12, verses 51 through 52, Jesus says plainly, Suppose ye that I am come to give peace on earth? I tell you, nay, but rather division. From henceforth there shall be 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. Jesus tells us plainly, he did not come to make peace, but to create division and ready himself for war. In the book of Revelation chapter 19, the writer tells us again of a vision he has of Jesus, which says, And I saw heaven opened, and behold a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. Revelation 19:11. Number 3. Jesus approves of God's genocide in the Old Testament. Another interesting facet of Jesus' words and beliefs are the fact that he himself supported the devastation and destruction that his father Yahweh caused in the Old Testament. This is important to truly grasp, since many of the New Testament followers of Jesus believed that the God of the Old Testament was fierce, jealous, and angry, killing off thousands of his own followers in a crude way. They believed the Jesus figure of the New Testament would never approve of these actions or even cause them himself. Jesus is a peaceful, loving guy, they'll say. All that stuff you bring up about God being evil is from the Old Testament. Well, it may come as a surprise to many New Testament loving Christians that Jesus himself not only approved of his Father's way of dealing with people, but that he promised that he himself, Jesus, would do the same and worse than his Father. Here are a few quotes from Jesus in the New Testament in which he points this out clearly. And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Matthew 10:14 through 15. Here, Jesus is saying that Sodom and Gomorrah was pleasant for those people compared to what Jesus himself will do when he returns and judges the world. He's promising that his Father's killing of an entire city, along with its men, women, and children, is nothing compared to the destruction that Jesus himself will do to the earth when he gets his chance. Next we have Matthew chapter 24:37, which says, But as the days of Noah were, so shall also be the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24:37. And also, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. The flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise also it was in the days of Lot. The same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Remember Lot's wife. Luke 17:26 through 32. In these verses from both Matthew and Luke, Jesus compares the massive destruction that came upon the earth in Noah's day to the massive destruction he himself will cause when he returns, calling it the days of the Son of Man. Keep in mind, during the destruction of Noah's time, God the Father killed every single man, woman, and child on the earth except for only 8 people, Noah and his family. Jesus says he will also destroy them all upon his return as well, but this time the earth will be judged with fire instead of floodwaters. Last in this section, Jesus says, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up." John 3:14. Here, Jesus refers to that time in the Old Testament where God sent venomous snakes to bite thousands of his own people in the wilderness because he was upset with them. After they cried out to God for mercy, he told them to build an idol in the image of a snake and set it up on a pole, and that whoever looked at the serpent idol would be healed from their poison. Jesus is referring to the punishment and idolatry of the Old Testament, not only supporting the narrative of this punishment system, but also implying that God would do a similar thing again, this time using Jesus as the idol on a stick. Without meaning to, Jesus rightfully implies that just as God caused the initial pain to the Israelites, which resulted in them needing to build an idol, God was also causing the Israelites pain in his day as well. Either way, it seems Jesus approves of these types of cruel and unusual punishment for God's own people. Number 4. Jesus was dismissive of people's feelings towards deceased family. It was quite customary for people to spend time mourning their deceased relatives during the time of Jesus' supposed ministry, especially for the Israelites. In fact, when Jesus himself died, all of his own family and friends stopped nearly everything they were doing to mourn for him. But when one of the men decided that they themselves wanted to follow Jesus and be one of his disciples, he only needed to do one more thing before he could leave his life behind: bury his deceased father, something that was not only customary but also incredibly important for the man's emotional well-being. If the man doesn't bury his own father, who will? But Jesus was so entirely self-obsessed that he refused to allow this, as we read in both the books of Matthew and Luke, which say, "And another of his disciples said unto him, Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father. But Jesus said unto him, Follow me, and let the dead bury the dead." Obviously, dead people can't bury themselves, and it was the responsibility of this man to take care of his own family's heritage and proper burial rites. But Jesus simply didn't care at all, showing no empathy or compassion for the man who had just lost his father. Number 5. Jesus encouraged his followers to mutilate themselves. It may seem crazy to consider, but in at least 3 places, Jesus told his followers to physically mutilate themselves in order to enter into the kingdom of heaven. The first 2 examples may sound familiar, and of course, many pastors will try and convince you that Jesus was being sarcastic or using metaphorical language to simply make a point. However, when we see how he felt about those who cut off their own genitals, we find that he wasn't kidding at all. The first example we see comes from Matthew chapter 5, which says, "Whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell." Matthew 5:28-30. Is Jesus being facetious? I don't think so. Later in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus doubles down on this teaching, saying, "If thy hand or foot offend thee, cut them off, and cast them from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life halt or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet, and to be cast into everlasting fire. And if thy eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee. It is better for thee to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes, and be cast into hellfire." Matthew 18:8-9. Interestingly, many pastors or Bible teachers of today pick and choose when they think Jesus was using hyperbole and when he was being quite literal, and unsurprisingly, they'll pretend Jesus was being graphic and fooling around just to make a point here. Here's why I don't think he was kidding at all. Matthew chapter 9 records the following. There are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuch for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. Matthew 19:12. Simply put, Jesus says there are three types of eunuch in his mind. The first type are those who are born without proper genitals, and the second are those whose genitals have been removed by someone else. The third and most important classification of eunuch, according to Jesus, are those who castrate themselves. Here Jesus says that the ones who castrated themselves, yes, those who cut off their own genitals, did so for the kingdom of heaven's sake. In other words, Jesus acknowledges that it's a literal, physical thing that people actually were doing to make themselves more suitable for heaven. In fact, Jesus ends his statement by saying, "He that is able to receive it," castration, "let him receive it." Did Jesus just encourage more people to do this? It seems so. This is why I'm convinced that Jesus also literally meant it would be better for us to mutilate and maim our own body for the sake of entering heaven. As it turns out, real people have actually done this, citing these very verses. Number 6. Jesus and his dad can't wait to torture everyone. This one goes without needing explanation. Let's just look at the words of Jesus himself, referring to those evil people who are like trees who don't produce fruit. Jesus promises that, quote, "Every tree that bringeth forth not good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire." Matthew 7:19. Later, Jesus reminds everyone to be very afraid, saying, "Fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." Matthew 10:28. In Matthew 13, Jesus again lets everyone know what he will do to them. "The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." Matthew 13:41-42. And again, "So shall it be at the end of the world. The angels shall come forth and sever the wicked from among the just, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." Matthew 13:49-50. And let's not forget Matthew 25. "Then shall he say also unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." Matthew 25:41. Like Jesus already mentioned before, he promises that when he returns, it won't be love, peace, and chicken grease for all of the earth. He's going to personally make earth a living hell, worse than the days of Noah were, where all of mankind was completely wiped out. Number 7. Jesus says that the Jews are all going to hell. When I first began to deconstruct Christianity and really looked at the New Testament with a more critical lens, I started to realize that there are many important themes held within it that are designed to make social and political points that are often missed by modern Christians. Simply, modern Christians don't understand the context of the New Testament and why it was actually created, but that's for another video. When taking in all the accounts of Jesus interacting with Jewish people in the Bible, Jesus quite literally hated and spoke against the Jewish people in nearly every instance, while simultaneously encouraging and loving the Gentiles or the Greco-Roman people in the narrative in almost every circumstance. Of course, I believe that this was done on purpose to suit the agenda of the time. If we go back and research all the times in which Jesus talks with a Jewish person versus talking with a non-Jew, you'll quickly find that Jesus is constantly speaking harshly against the ancient Jewish way of life, while encouraging the readers to sympathize and love the Romans. The bigger point for now is this. Jesus says that the Jews are doomed for destruction when he says, "Truly I tell you, with no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from east and west and recline at table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the sons of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Matthew 8:10-12. You see here that Jesus is claiming that there are no Jewish people or Israelites in all of Judea who have as much faith as this random Roman centurion. That alone is a massive slap in the face to all the sincere and zealous people in Israel who truly sought to keep the commandments and love God according to the system that he himself put in place for them in the Old Testament. Then Jesus goes even further, saying that the, quote, sons of the kingdom, which refer to the literal people in the kingdom of Israel, would be thrown into the outer darkness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Using this verse and many others like it, you can see clearly where many Christians of the past and present get their intense anti-Semitism. It's promoted by Jesus himself. Of course, Jewish scholars already know quite well that Jesus frequently spoke against the laws of Moses and the people of Israel. Here's another verse in which we see Jesus hating the Jewish people relentlessly, simply for obeying the laws of Moses and rejecting his heretical teachings. Speaking directly to the Jewish people, he said, "O generation of vipers, how can ye, being evil, speak good things?" Then certain of the scribes and the Pharisees answered, saying, "Master, we would see a sign from thee." But he answered and said unto them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign." Matthew 12:34 through 39, and 16 verse 4. Oddly, Jesus himself uses miracles to convince all of his followers of his divine authority. He even bestowed upon his disciples the power to do miracles so that they could also convert more followers. Why then would Jesus claim that only evil and adulterous people seek after a miracle to confirm their belief when the Jews asked for proof? Even the book of Deuteronomy allows for miracles to be used by prophets to confirm their power in God, but Jesus refused to show them one. Were these verses written this way as a defense against the Jewish people, who would surely state later that Jesus had no miraculous power? If the living Jewish people were to claim that Jesus had no power, Christ's followers could simply argue that Jesus didn't want to show them miracles because they were perverse and adulterous, or that they didn't have enough faith. A clear cop-out for not actually having any real demonstrable power. Number 8. Jesus was a false prophet. Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 21 is a verse contained in the Old Testament's Torah, known today by Christians as a portion of the laws of Moses. In this book it says, "And if you say in your heart, how may we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him." Deuteronomy 18:21. In other words, if a so-called prophet comes to the Israelites and makes predictions about what shall come to pass, and it does not come to pass, that prophet is a false prophet, and you should have no fear of their words or warnings. With that in mind, here are a few prophecies of Jesus Christ that ultimately fell flat on their face. "Verily I say unto you, ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come." Matthew 10:23. In this section of the New Testament, Jesus is saying that in the near future, after he himself is gone, that they will encounter persecution among many other things while they're evangelizing and spreading the good news of his coming. Within this statement, however, Jesus also promises that before his disciples are even done going through all the cities of Israel to proclaim the gospel, that he will return. Of course, we know from obvious history that Jesus never did return at all, and certainly, even if he does, it wouldn't have happened in the clear time frame that Jesus himself laid out, making him a false prophet. But it gets worse. Jesus' false promises continue later when he says, "Verily I say unto you, there be some standing here which shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Matthew 16:28, Mark 9:1, and Luke 9:27. In other words, Jesus here is promising his disciples that some of them won't even die physically before he comes back in the power of his kingdom. Again, Jesus never returned, and clearly all of his disciples would eventually die without seeing him come in the clouds. Another failed false promise of the false prophet Jesus. But he's not done yet. Here, Jesus doubles down in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Specifically in Matthew 24, Jesus claims that immediately after the tribulation of those days the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in the heaven a sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Matthew 24:29 through 31. That sounds pretty apocalyptic, doesn't it? Here's the rub. Jesus claimed that all these things would happen before the generation of people living in his time died of old age, saying, "Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled." Matthew 24:34, Mark 13:30, and Luke 21:32. Unfortunately for Jesus and his followers, none of those things came to pass, and everyone living in that generation died. This is already the third false prophecy of Jesus mentioned in just this tiny study. Let's cap it off with just one more simple one. In the book of Revelation, Jesus is said to have appeared through an angelic vision to give his people more details on the events and timeline. It is here that he says, "Behold, I come quickly." Revelation 3:11, 22:7, 22:11, and 22:20. What exactly did quickly mean to Jesus? Certainly after 2,000 years, it should be abundantly obvious that not only did Jesus fail to return quickly, but he failed to return altogether. It should be mentioned here that I recently created a video breaking down many of the ways in which Jesus not only spoke against the laws of Moses or the Torah, but he also personally broke this law, making himself a false prophet according to the requirements in the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 13 and 18. This video is titled, "Jesus Clearly Broke the Torah," and it outlines why Jesus was never truly a prophet and makes even clearer why modern Jews reject his character outright. Number 9. Jesus approved of torture. Although I could and eventually might just list out another 20 plus reasons, let's hit one more example of how Jesus was a bad guy by demonstrating that he approves of torture, if you didn't already notice from the verses before. In the book of Matthew chapter 18, Jesus tells us a parable, which he often did intentionally to confuse people so they couldn't be saved, according to Mark 4:11 through 12. In this parable, Jesus discusses a hypothetical man who is indebted and is forgiven his debt by his master. Later, the man whose debt was forgiven refuses to forgive someone else of their debts, and so his master delivers him over to the tormentors. After telling this parable, Jesus says directly that he and his Father are going to do the same thing to you and I if we don't forgive everyone who owes you something. Here we read the words of Jesus in Matthew 18 when he says, "And the Lord was wroth, and delivered him to the tormentors, till he should pay all that was due unto him. So likewise shall my heavenly Father also do unto you, if ye from your hearts forgive not every one his brother their trespasses." Matthew 18:34 through 35. It's bad enough that Jesus is saying that he and his Father are going to send you to the tormentors, and yes, the translation of Strong's word 930 basinistes in English literally is the one who tortures. But it might be even worse that here Jesus is giving abusers in the church and Christian family hierarchy permission to force their subordinates to forgive them no matter what or who they do. Let's say, for example, that your Christian father becomes incredibly angry with you because you disobeyed him and out of anger decides to physically abuse you, slap you, grab you by the arm and force you to the ground to, quote, show you who's boss. Clearly, this is physical abuse and should never be tolerated in any healthy parent-child relationship. But have no fear, because of verses like this one in Matthew 18, your father could coerce you to forgive him through the fear and intimidation of Jesus' punishment mentioned above. It's easy for abusers to gaslight their victims into believing that they are the problem if they refuse to forgive any one of their trespasses without any need for the parent or any other abuser to get help for their abusive actions and change their ways. "We're all sinners," the abusers will say, "and you need to forgive me or you won't be forgiven by God yourself." In fact, it's verses like these that give Christian leaders the audacity to demand the forgiveness of their congregation when they sexually assault one of the young members of the church. Forgive and be forgiven. If you won't forgive, Christ won't let you live. Clearly, there are 0 scriptures in the Bible which teach the importance of setting boundaries with abusers and actually provides ample justification for parental abuse in many circumstances. Do you think that Jesus and his dad should torture people for not forgiving others right away? To conclude, I should mention that there are far more examples of this kind of bad behavior from Jesus in the New Testament. From Jesus intentionally confusing people so that they can't be saved, to his psychotic belief in demons and devils, his overt racism towards outsiders, or even his clear lack of understanding of basic biology. Even Jesus' own friends in the New Testament thought that he was truly insane. Perhaps I'll cover more examples of Jesus' ridiculous behavior in future videos. In the meantime, I have to encourage you to check out my New Testament Debunked playlist to find even more reasons why Jesus was certainly not the man that most people think he was. Jesus doesn't want to spread a message of love, unity, peace, and unconditional forgiveness. Instead, the more we study, the more we can see that he was a bloodthirsty, warmongering psychopath who approved of God's torture to the Israelites in the Old Testament and plans to help his Father do even worse in the future so-called days of the Son of Man. So what do you think? Was Jesus really just a peace-loving, all-forgiving good guy? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, I'm Justin with Bullet Holes in the Bible. Love and peace to you all.